So Mark Carney just delivered a move that nobody in Washington saw coming. Not the State Department, which has been tracking Canadian trade diversification across 6 continents for 8 months. Not the Pentagon, which has been monitoring critical mineral supply chains with increasing alarm. Not the Commerce Department, which has been modeling Canadian retaliation scenarios across every domain. Not the White House, which has been scrambling since the Musk exposure to project the appearance of strategic coherence. Nobody. A single action that landed without warning, and that has fundamentally changed the geometry of the trade war in a way that no analyst predicted, no contingency plan prepared for, and no agency has a framework to address. Washington is scrambling, and I don't use that word casually. This isn't the typical political posturing that follows a Canadian announcement. This is multi-agency panic. The Pentagon has convened an emergency session of the Defense Industrial Base Working Group. State Department officials who were off for the weekend have been recalled to headquarters. Congressional leadership from both parties has requested classified briefings from the intelligence community. The National Security Council held an unscheduled meeting within hours of the announcement. The scramble is real. It's chaotic, and it is itself evidence of how completely unprepared the American government was for what Carney just did. Warren Buffett called it the single most consequential move of the entire trade war, and potentially the one move that forces the trade war to end. Not because Canada won a decisive battle, because Carney changed the game so fundamentally that continuing the old game is no longer possible. When you hear what he did and why Buffett says it changes everything, you'll understand why every agency in Washington is trying to respond and failing. Subscribe right now, because the development I'm about to describe will be studied in geopolitical strategy courses for decades to understand why what Carney did qualifies as a genuine surprise. Not just an unexpected escalation, but a structural redirection of the entire trade war. You have to understand what everyone expected, and what everyone expected reveals the assumption that Carney just destroyed. The trade war had settled into a recognizable pattern over 8 months of escalation and counter-escalation. Canada acts across established domains, retaliatory tariffs, energy weaponization, mineral embargo signals, aviation restrictions, auto severance, financial decoupling. And Washington absorbs the impact with varying degrees of paralysis and ineffective countermeasures. The domains were known, the tactics were documented, the partnerships were cataloged. Germany and the $180 billion corridor, Japan and the mineral contracts, Korea and the industrial agreements, the European Union through CETA, the Commonwealth's 56 nations, the CPTP spanning the Asia-Pacific. Canada's diversification strategy was the most impressive middle power economic reorientation in modern history. Analysts across the world acknowledge that. But it operated within a clearly defined framework, the framework of Western democratic alliances. Canada was building partnerships with nations that shared its values, its governance standards, its commitment to rule of law institutions and market-based economics. The trajectory was dramatic, but the direction was predictable. More European agreements, more Asian bilateral deals with allied democracies, more Commonwealth integration. The deck was known, even if the sequence of cards was occasionally surprising. And beneath that predictability sat an unspoken assumption, an assumption so deeply embedded in the strategic thinking of every analyst, every diplomat, and every official in every Western capital that nobody even articulated it out loud. Stating the assumption would have meant acknowledging the possibility that it could be violated, and nobody believed it would be violated. The assumption was this: Canada's diversification would stay within the Western democratic framework. No matter how aggressive the trade war became, no matter how comprehensive Carney's strategy grew, no matter how many domains were weaponized or how many partnerships were signed, there was a line invisible, undiscussed, universally accepted between the partners that Canada would engage and the one partner that would remain off limits. The one relationship that would transform the trade war from a bilateral economic dispute into something fundamentally different, something that would terrify Washington at the level of national security, defense strategy, and global power competition, rather than merely at the level of trade economics. Everyone assumed the China line would never be crossed. Washington assumed it. European allies assumed it. Asian partners assumed it. Market analysts assumed it. the assumption was so deeply embedded that it functioned as a constraint on strategic thinking. Nobody even modeled what would happen if it was violated because nobody believed it would be. And then Mark Carney, with the precision of a central banker who has managed two G7 central banks through the worst crises of the modern financial era, and the strategic audacity of a leader who has spent 8 months demonstrating that he does not bluff, does not telegraph, and does not make moves. He hasn't prepared for months in advance, crossed it. The Canada-China Strategic Resource and Trade Accord, the CCSRTA, was announced at a bilateral press conference in Ottawa with Chinese trade officials present. Carney stood flanked by his trade minister and China's commerce minister. The framework had been negotiated for months in complete secrecy. No leaks, no previews, no advanced signals to Washington. It landed fully formed, comprehensive, and operational. And it gives Beijing a direct, structured, preferential pathway to the exact resources that America has been trying to secure through executive orders, national security directives, and threats of secondary sanctions. The first component is preferential mineral access. China receives preferred buyer status for Canadian lithium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth elements, the same critical minerals that the Pentagon considers essential to American defense manufacturing, the same minerals that form the backbone of the global EV supply chain, and the same minerals that the North American Resource Security Directive attempted to claim as American national security assets. Not exclusive access, preferred access, meaning China gets first right of refusal on expanded Canadian mineral production at market rates. The 2 5-year contracts with Germany, Japan, and Korea remain intact. But the new mineral production that Canada has been developing, the expanded mining operations, the 8 billion ton aluminum deposit, the processing facilities being built across northern Canada now has a preferred buyer, and that buyer is Beijing. The second component is an energy exploration partnership, joint Canada-China development of Canadian Arctic and northern energy resources, natural gas, hydrogen production, and clean energy projects. Chinese capital and infrastructure engineering expertise combined with Canadian resource deposits and regulatory frameworks. The partnership creates a new energy development corridor in regions that have been discussed for decades but never commercially developed at scale. Chinese investment in Canadian energy infrastructure represents billions of dollars in capital that accelerates Canadian resource development while creating supply relationships that bind the two economies together. The third component is agricultural trade expansion. Canada opens expanded agricultural export channels to China, canola, wheat, beef, pork, and specialty crops, replacing the trade volumes that American tariffs and trade disruption have affected, and opening access to 1.4 billion consumers. Canadian farmers who've been caught in the crossfire of the trade war and have been vocal about the damage to agricultural exports now have a massive new market that dwarfs any single Western partner. The agricultural channel alone represents tens of billions in annual trade potential. The fourth component is currency cooperation, a bilateral CAD-Yuan settlement mechanism for resource and trade transactions between Canada and China, bypassing the US dollar entirely, not replacing the dollar and global trade, creating a dedicated Canada-China financial channel that doesn't touch American banking infrastructure, doesn't route through American clearing systems, and doesn't expose Canadian-Chinese transactions to American financial surveillance or sanctions. This builds on the Euro settlement systems that Canada has already developed with European partners, extending the principle of financial sovereignty to the world's second largest economy. The fifth component is the Arctic Shipping Corridor, joint development of northern shipping routes through Canadian territorial waters, creating a trade pathway between Canadian resource extraction sites and Chinese markets that is shorter, faster, and cheaper than any existing Pacific route. As Arctic ice recedes, these corridors become commercially viable, and the nation that develops them controls the terms of access. Canada and China, under this framework, will jointly develop the infrastructure, navigation systems, and port facilities that make the Arctic corridor operational. The route cuts thousands of miles off the distance between Canadian resources and Chinese consumers. The framework includes explicit carve-outs that Carney designed to make it diplomatically defensible, no military cooperation whatsoever, no defense technology sharing, no intelligence coordination, an explicit human rights clause requiring compliance with Canadian human rights standards on all joint projects conducted under the framework, Canadian regulatory authority maintained in full over all resource extraction, Chinese partnership, not Chinese ownership. No Chinese acquisition of Canadian resource companies is permitted. Sunset and review clauses at 5-year intervals that allow either side to modify or terminate specific components. The carve-outs are not cosmetic. They are structural, designed to ensure that the framework cannot be characterized as a strategic alliance with China against Western interests. It is a commercial relationship, a trade framework. Business Carney's public statement was calibrated with the same devastating precision that has characterized every major announcement of the trade war. Canada's resource and trade diversification strategy has always been guided by Canadian interests, not by any other nation's preferences about who Canada should or should not trade with. We have built partnerships with Germany, Japan, Korea, the European Union, the Commonwealth, and dozens of other nations across 6 continents. We are now extending that diversification to include the world's second-largest economy. The framework is commercial, transparent, and structured to maintain Canadian sovereignty, Canadian valuatory authority over our own resources. We did not seek the genius of the statement is in what Carney didn't say. He didn't criticize America by name. He didn't frame the framework as retaliation or punishment or leverage. He framed it as the natural, rational, commercially logical extension of a diversification strategy that America's own trade policy made necessary. And the framing neutralizes Washington's most potent political counterattack. The administration will want to characterize this as choosing China over America. But Carney's statement makes clear that Canada didn't choose China over anyone. Canada was forced to diversify by American trade policy, and China is simply the latest and largest addition to a diversification portfolio that now spans every major economy on the planet. The framework includes explicit human rights standards, security carve-outs, and regulatory sovereignty provisions that make it impossible to characterize as ideological alignment with Beijing. Carney isn't siding with China. He's adding China to a commercial portfolio that exists because Washington destroyed the bilateral alternative. The cause and the consequence point in the same direction, and both point back to the trade war itself. And then Warren Buffett explained why this single move may have changed the trajectory of the entire trade war and why it may ultimately be remembered as the move that ended it. In 60 years of studying markets and competitive dynamics, Buffett said, "I have never seen a strategic move that simultaneously solves one problem and creates another with such precision." Carney solved Canada's diversification ceiling, the finite capacity of Western markets to absorb Canadian resource output, and created Washington's worst strategic nightmare, Chinese institutional access to North American critical minerals, with a single announcement. The architectural elegance of that is something I've only seen a handful of times in my career, and never in a geopolitical context. For 8 months, the trade war operated as a bilateral contest. United States versus Canada, 2 parties, 2 positions, one attempting to coerce through economic size, the other resisting through strategic preparation and resource leverage. That bilateral framework ultimately favored America because American market size, while declining in relative importance to Canada through the diversification strategy, remained the single largest demand source for Canadian exports. The Western alternatives were impressive and growing, but they were bounded. Europe, Japan, Korea, the Commonwealth, collectively significant but ultimately finite in their capacity to absorb the full output of Canada's resource base. Carney just turned the bilateral contest into a triangle. The United States, Canada, and China. And in any triangle involving resources, the party positioned in the middle, the party that controls the resources and can sell to either of the other two, holds the structural leverage. That's not a geopolitical theory. That's 60 years of watching commodity markets. The seller who can choose between 2 competing buyers sets the terms. Canada is now positioned between 2 competing economies, the world's largest and the world's second largest, both of which want Canadian minerals, Canadian energy, and Canadian agricultural products. That positioning is the most powerful leverage any middle power has held in modern economic history. Washington now faces a choice it never wanted, never prepared for, and never even considered as a possibility that required contingency planning. Continue the trade war and watch Canada's resource base integrate progressively with China. Chinese preferred buyer status deepening across mineral categories. Chinese capital flowing into Canadian Arctic and northern energy development. Chinese agricultural imports replacing American agricultural exports. CAD on settlement normalizing as a parallel financial channel outside the dollar, or make meaningful concessions to Canada that reverse the trade war. Restore the bilateral relationship and accept publicly that the entire trade strategy has failed. Both options are catastrophic for the American position. Continuing the trade war accelerates Chinese integration with Canadian resources, producing more of the exact outcome American strategic policy has been designed to prevent for 40 years. Reversing the trade war validates every Canadian action and vindicates Carney's approach in a way that restructures the power dynamics of North American diplomacy permanently. Both doors lead to the same room, American strategic retreat. The genius of Carney's move is that he designed the framework so that both paths converge on the same destination. The only variable is how long the journey takes and how much damage accumulates along the way. On the unspoken assumption, every analyst, every diplomat, every strategist, and every allied capital assumed that Canada's diversification would remain within the Western democratic framework, Europe, Commonwealth, allied Asia-Pacific. Those partnerships are real and growing and will continue regardless of the China framework. But the unspoken assumption was that the China line would never be crossed. That line was the last constraint on Canadian leverage, because as long as diversification stayed Western, American strategic interests regarding its primary global competitor were ultimately preserved, even as American economic interests suffered. Carney erased the line, not by abandoning Western values. The framework has human rights clauses, security carve-outs, and complete Canadian regulatory control over all resource extraction. Not by choosing China over the West. The Western partnerships remain intact and continue to deepen. But by demonstrating a principle that Washington refused to accept, the decision about who Canada trades with belongs to Canada. The line between acceptable and unacceptable trading partners is a sovereign decision made in Ottawa, not in Washington. And Carney just exercised that sovereignty in the most consequential way possible. On the market implications, Canadian resources with structured commercial access to every major economy on Earth, America, Europe, Asia-Pacific allies, the Commonwealth, and now China, represent the most valuable and most strategically positioned commodity portfolio in the world. No other resource base combines Canada's geological depth with the breadth of market access that Carney has built over 8 months. Berkshire's Canadian resource exposure, which we've been building throughout this trade war, reflects this thesis. The China framework accelerates it substantially. The cost of continuing the trade war changed permanently today. It now includes Chinese preferred buyer access to North American critical minerals, the minerals that go into F-35 fighters that power the next generation of electric vehicles that form the backbone of advanced electronics and communications manufacturing. That cost is one that no Pentagon, no administration, no Congress can sustain indefinitely. Carney may have just ended the trade war, not by winning a decisive battle, but by making the cost of continuing too high for any American government to accept. And he did it with a move that nobody saw coming, that was negotiated in complete secrecy, and that landed fully formed with no advanced warning. That's not just strategy, that's mastery. Washington's scramble is happening across every agency simultaneously. And the chaos and incoherence of the response reveals how completely unprepared the American government was for a move that nobody modeled, nobody anticipated, and nobody has a playbook for. The Pentagon is in alarm mode, and not the performative alarm that accompanies routine policy disputes, but the genuine operational alarm that triggers emergency working groups and classified assessments. Defense officials are conducting an urgent evaluation of what Chinese preferred buyer status for Canadian critical minerals means for the American defense industrial base. The minerals in question are not abstract commodities. They are specific, identified, essential inputs to specific weapon systems and defense technologies. Lithium goes into the advanced batteries that power military electronics and next-generation vehicles. Cobalt is essential to the superalloys used in jet engine turbine blades, including the engines and F-35 fighters. Nickel goes into armor plating, submarine hulls, and precision munitions. Rare earth elements are in every guided missile, every radar system, every satellite, every piece of advanced military communications equipment the United States manufactures. These are the minerals that the administration tried to secure through executive orders and national security directives, the same minerals that now have a preferred buyer in Beijing. A senior Pentagon official told reporters that the department is evaluating all options for ensuring defense mineral security, which in Washington language means we have no idea what to do and are hoping that saying all options buys us time to figure it out. The State Department is panicking at the diplomatic level because the China framework transforms the trade war from a manageable bilateral economic dispute into a triangular U.S., Canada, China strategic competition, an entirely different and far more dangerous game that activates fault lines across every alliance and every negotiation the United States is conducting globally. Every allied government is reassessing. Every ongoing diplomatic initiative now has a China-Canada dimension that didn't exist 24 hours ago. The Europeans are asking whether their own Canadian resource partnerships are secure or whether Chinese preferred buyer status will redirect supply away from European industry. The Japanese and Korean governments are evaluating whether their 2 5-year mineral contracts remain intact or whether the new China framework creates competition for supply. The diplomatic complexity just multiplied exponentially, and the State Department's China desk and Canada desk, which have operated as entirely separate portfolios for the entirety of the trade war, are now discovering they needed to have been working together for months. The Commerce Department and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative are confronting the collapse of their core analytical assumption, the assumption on which the entire American trade strategy was built. The strategy depended on Canada having limited alternatives for its exports. The reasoning was straightforward. Canada needed American markets because no other single market was large enough to absorb Canadian resource output at comparable scale. That reasoning justified the tariffs, justified the escalation, justified the belief that Canadian resistance would eventually collapse because economic gravity would pull Canadian exports back south. China is a market of 1.44 billion consumers in the world's second largest economy, with the world's most insatiable and rapidly growing appetite for exactly the resources that Canada produces in abundance. Minerals, energy, agricultural products, processed materials. The addition of China to Canada's diversification portfolio doesn't just add another trading partner alongside Germany and Japan. It makes Canadian alternatives functionally unlimited. The arithmetic that sustained the trade war strategic logic that Canada needed American markets more than America needed Canadian resources just inverted permanently. Canada's resource base now has commercial access to every major economy on Earth. No other resource exporting nation in history has achieved that level of market diversification in 8 months. Congress is in bipartisan panic, a rare condition in a legislative body that agrees on almost nothing. National security hawks are terrified that Chinese capital and preferred buyer agreements are gaining structured institutional treaty-level access to North American mineral resources that these same hawks have spent their entire careers trying to keep within the Western supply chain. Trade moderates and diplomacy advocates are horrified that the trade war has accomplished the precise outcome that decades of American bipartisan foreign policy were specifically designed to prevent: pushing a major Western democracy, America's closest ally and longest-standing trading partner, into a formal commercial framework with Beijing. Both parties agree the development is catastrophic for American strategic interests. Neither party has a solution that doesn't involve doing what the administration has refused to do for 8 months, reversing the trade war, making concessions to Canada, and restoring the bilateral relationship that made the China framework unnecessary. The White House faces a political paradox that has no clean resolution. Carney is trading with China is simultaneously the most politically useful attack line the administration has had in months and the most strategically devastating development of the entire trade war. They can weaponize it domestically, framing Carney as aligned with Beijing, questioning Canadian loyalty to Western values, painting the framework as a betrayal of the democratic alliance. The political messaging writes itself and will generate significant domestic reaction. But the political attack doesn't change the economic or strategic reality. Chinese preferred buyer status for Canadian minerals is now a contractual fact. CAD-Yuan settlement is operational. Arctic corridor development has begun. Agricultural exports are flowing toward 1.4 billion consumers. The framework exists. It was designed to be commercially defensible, diplomatically structured, and legally sound. Attacking it politically doesn't make it disappear. Only reversing the trade war does. The forced choice that Buffett identified is the endgame logic of this move. And understanding why both options are catastrophic for Washington requires understanding the dynamics of a triangle that didn't exist until this morning. Every day that the trade war continues from this point forward, the China framework deepens. Chinese investment flows into Canadian resource development. Not theoretical future investment, but operational capital that funds, mines, builds processing facilities, and creates infrastructure that binds the two economies together through physical assets. Chinese mineral procurement under preferred buyer terms becomes normalized. Purchasing relationships that begin as contractual arrangements mature into institutional dependencies that Chinese industrial planning absorbs into long-term strategy. Agricultural trade volumes grow as Chinese consumers discover Canadian canola, wheat, and beef. And Canadian farmers discover a market of 1.4 billion people whose demand for protein and grain is growing faster than any other market on earth. The Arctic corridor advances from planning to construction to operation. CAD-Yuan settlement expands from a bilateral mechanism to a model that other nations consider replicating. Each day that passes makes the China-Canada commercial relationship more embedded, more institutional, more normalized, and harder to reverse. Continuing the trade war doesn't just maintain the status quo. It actively deepens the integration between Canadian resources and Chinese demand, producing with every passing day more of the exact strategic outcome that Washington spent decades trying to prevent. The alternative, reversing the trade war, would require the administration to publicly acknowledge that the trade strategy failed from inception, that the tariffs damaged American industry more than Canadian industry, exactly as the unread briefings predicted that Canada's retaliatory actions were provoked and proportional, exactly as international observers assessed that Carney's sovereignty assertions were legitimate, exactly as international law affirmed. That every Canadian action, the energy weaponization, the mineral leverage, the auto severance, the aviation restrictions, the alliance diversification, was the rational strategic response of a sovereign nation to unprovoked economic aggression. The political cost of that admission is enormous. Careers end. Narratives collapse. The image of strength that sustained the trade wars, domestic support for 8 months, disintegrates. But the strategic cost of not reversing, of allowing the China framework to deepen week after week, month after month, is Chinese preferred buyer access to North American critical minerals that go into American fighter jets and missile systems. Chinese capital developing the Canadian Arctic resources that American strategic planners considered part of the Western resource base, a permanent commercial framework between Canada and Beijing that restructures global resource flows for a generation and that cannot be unwound through executive orders or social media posts. Both paths lead to American strategic retreat. That's the architecture of the move designed by a man who thinks in systems and builds in decades so that the choice between continuing and conceding produces the same fundamental outcome. The only variable is the timeline and the terms. Reverse the trade war now, and the China framework can be moderated, modified, scaled back under a restored bilateral relationship. Continue the trade war, and the China framework deepens until it becomes permanent, and the eventual retreat happens from a weaker position on worse terms after more damage has been done. The global response has been immediate and revealing. Allied governments, the same governments that have been watching the trade war with increasing alarm, are processing the China framework with a mixture of shock and grudging admiration. European officials, speaking anonymously, described the move as strategically brilliant and diplomatically terrifying. Japan's trade ministry issued a carefully worded statement affirming its own partnership with Canada while acknowledging that all nations have the sovereign right to pursue commercial relationships that serve their national interests. The international consensus is crystallizing rapidly. The trade war created the conditions for the China framework, and the China framework may create the conditions for the trade war's end. For 8 months, the trade war operated on an assumption so deeply held that nobody bothered to state it out loud, because stating it would have acknowledged the possibility of its violation, and nobody believed that was possible. The assumption was that Canada's diversification would stay within the Western democratic framework, that the China line was enviable, that no matter how far Canada pushed, no matter how comprehensively Carney diversified, no matter how many domains were weaponized or how many partnerships were signed across how many continents, the one line that separated manageable trade war from strategic catastrophe would remain intact. American strategic interests regarding its primary global competitor were ultimately safe. That was the bedrock assumption, and it was wrong. Carney didn't merely cross the line Washington assumed would hold, he erased it. The announcement arrived without warning, negotiated in complete secrecy, unveiled as a fully structured 5-pillar framework, complete with legal carve-outs, human rights provisions, and sovereign safeguards. This was not improvisation. It bore the institutional weight of something engineered over months, while Washington remained consumed by executive orders, tariff escalations, and public messaging cycles. The agreement is commercially structured, diplomatically defensible, and strategically calibrated to grant Beijing preferred access to the very critical minerals the United States has been attempting to secure through national security directives and threats of secondary sanctions. And crucially, it is insulated from ideological attack. With explicit human rights clauses, security exclusions, and full Canadian regulatory control, the framework cannot credibly be framed as geopolitical alignment with China. It is framed deliberately and surgically as sovereign commercial diversification. Carney did not position Canada as choosing Beijing over Washington. He positioned Canada as choosing sovereignty over dependency. The deeper strategic shock is causal. This framework was not an opportunistic pivot. It was the logical consequence of the trade war itself. China did not pull Canada away from the United States. American trade escalation pushed Canada toward an alternative. The bilateral relationship that once made Chinese access unnecessary was fractured, and Carney filled the vacuum. The trade war was intended to constrain Canada. Instead, it expanded Canada's options. It was meant to isolate leverage. It multiplied it. Now, Washington faces a strategic equation it never modeled. The Pentagon cannot accept structured Chinese access to North American critical minerals. The State Department cannot accept the transformation of a bilateral dispute into triangular great power competition. The Commerce Department cannot accept the collapse of its leverage thesis, the assumption that Canada ultimately had nowhere else to go. Congress, on both sides, cannot accept that the trade strategy may have produced the precise alignment it sought to prevent. And yet every path forward converges on the same conclusion. Either the trade war is reversed and the bilateral relationship restored publicly, acknowledging that escalation failed, or the China framework deepens month by month. Preferred mineral access becomes normalized. Chinese capital becomes embedded in Arctic energy corridors. Agricultural supply chains permanently reorient. A CAD-Yuan settlement channel gradually expands beyond the dollar's reach, eroding monetary dominance not in a single shock, but through steady normalization. This is the compounding cost that, as Buffett observed, may ultimately end the trade war. Not overnight, not through a dramatic capitulation, but because the alternative is a structural shift that no American administration, regardless of party, can tolerate indefinitely. Carney's move transformed coercive trade pressure into a contest of strategic endurance fought on geometry he designed. The contest is no longer linear, it is triangular. And in any triangle defined by competing buyers and scarce resources, the power resides with the party in the middle. Washington did not see this coming. And more critically, it does not yet have a response that avoids the outcome it fears most.